But have you ever, felt like you were depressed? Like God just wasn't there. There was something missing, a void. This is actually called the dark night of the soul. And this phenomenon is described as a Madeleine that the greatest Christians have suffered from time to time. It's this Madeleine that provoked David to soak his pillow with tears. To Jeremiah, he was named the weeping prophet. And also afflicted Martin Luther. Who knows Martin Luther? He grew up as a Catholic, and then he done the Reformation, and then moved church, and it threatened to destroy him. And these are no ordinary fits of depression, but it's a depression that's linked to a crisis in faith, a crisis that comes from one sense. When you sense the absence of God, you just feel like you're out there in a void, and just, where's God? You feel like He's abandoned you. And this spiritual depression is real. It can be acute. And we ask, how is a person of faith, how could they experience spiritual lows? But whatever provokes it, it doesn't take from the reality that you're in. And our faith is in a constant action. It's mobile. It's volatile. We move from faith to faith. And in between, we have periods of doubt where we cry out, Lord, I believe. Help. Help my unbelief. Have you ever thought about Jesus? How do you think He felt when He was on the cross? Do you remember? Watch this short clip. Surely He bore our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we estimate Him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But He was pierced for our transgressions, He was crushed for our iniquities. So even God, as Jesus, He felt this dark night of the soul. In that instance, He asked, my God, why have you abandoned me? So why would we expect not to feel that at some point? Sometimes it makes us feel like we're less of a Christian. But sometimes we have to go through these times. In my classes at Mount Vernon, we had to read this book. And he says, every follower of Jesus at some point will confront the wall, or as the ancients call it, the dark night of the soul. This book, Emotionally and Healthy Spiritually, helps provide a partial roadmap of both how one goes through the wall and what it means to begin living on the other side of this. Failure to understand its nature results in great long-term pain and confusion. But if we receive the gift of God in the wall, however, it transforms our lives forever. Amen. Affliction makes God appear to be absent for a time, more absent than a dead man, more absent than light in utter darkness of a cell. During this absence, there is nothing to love. The soul has to go on loving in the emptiness. or at least going on wanting to love. Though it may be with just part of itself. One day, God will come and show himself to this soul and reveal the beauty of the world to it, as in the case of Job. How many of us are familiar with Job and what he went through? We're going to look at Job 1 through 3. Under the New Living Translation. There was once a man named Job who lived in the land of Uz. He was blameless, a man of complete integrity. He feared God and he stayed away from evil. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters. He owned 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camel, 500 teams of oxen, and 500 female donkeys. He also had many servants. He was, in fact, the richest man in that entire area. Job had the life, didn't he? He had nothing to worry about. He was doing good. He was living high, Nothing to fear. But then what do we find out? We flip over to verse 6. We're told, one day the members of the heavenly court came to present themselves before the Lord. The accuser Satan came with them. Why have you come? Where have you come from? The Lord asked Satan. Satan answered the Lord, I've been patrolling the earth, watching everything that is going on. Then the Lord asked Satan, have you noticed my servant Job? He is the finest man in all earth. He is blameless, a man of complete integrity. He fears God and he stays away from evil. Satan replied to the Lord, yes, but Job has good reason to fear the Lord. You have always put a wall of protection around him and his home and his property. You have made him prosper in everything he does. Look at how rich he is. But reach out and take away everything that he has, and he will surely curse you to your face. All right, you may test him, the Lord said to Satan. Do whatever you want with everything he possesses, but do not harm him physically. So Satan left the Lord's presence. So if you're familiar with this story, you know that it goes on and Satan does everything he could to Job without harming him. Takes away all his children, takes away all his possessions. Job's left with nothing. But he still keeps his faith in God. And he never cursed God. He was inflicted with the loss of his wealth, his possessions, and while trying to regroup, losing his complete family. Soon after, he was physically had to deal with boils all over his body. And his wife was no help. She just doesn't understand what is happening and what her husband wants her husband to curse God and die. Has anybody ever dealt with depression? Did you feel like Job? And like that his wife just didn't know what was happening, didn't understand. Just curse God. Just curse God and get it over with. In the last year, I've gone through this, the dark night of the soul. I've gone through some major depression. And Robert would always ask me, what can I do? How can I help? And my answer was always the same. You don't understand what I'm going through. And I just chose to suffer alone. Like Job, he was a hurting man. His heart was broken, and it was laid open before God. This is a man that is yelling at God, crying out to God, one in need of someone to comfort him, one who is looking for love, and someone to step into his life to show him that his life matters. I'm going to flip over to Romans for a moment. and look at Romans 8:28. We're told, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. It's hard to be all in on God when you think God is the one that is doing these things to you, but he's not. Sometimes he does allow things to happen to draw you closer to him, to kind of give you a reality check. Wait a minute. Think you're up here? You got it all? And sometimes God just will allow something to happen to, hey, remember, whose is this? Who is giving you all this? It's not you. You know, this verse is preceded by verses of prayer. But we don't know what to pray in our weakness. The Holy Spirit of God invited us to pray. Give us words to be prayed so that God is invited into that relationship. Job cried out in depression. He cries out to God and at God. I feel like sometimes we can't cry out at God. But Job was beside himself, and he's feeling pain that he doesn't know what to do with. Have you ever felt this way? Have you ever been at a point and thought that God has turned against you? I think that most of us have at some point. God created each of us. He knows what emotions we feel because he gave us those emotions. He came to earth as a babe in a manger and then died on that cross. He knows more pain than we do. You know, it's okay if we experience them. We have to recognize them for what they are. We pretend with others that we don't feel them because we feel like we shouldn't feel this way. We're Christians. We rationalize that we are more mature than to fall apart and not be in control. Why do people get stuck in their spiritual lives? Why do we feel trapped and powerless? The reason we feel powerless is because we have no vent in which to release these feelings. We just feel like we have to hold them all inside, that we can't cry out. But Job chose to. He cried out to God. And when he cried out to God, God began to do a work. Why do people not grow up in their faith? It's because we don't see the big picture. Until we have that freedom to cry out to a Holy Spirit, a God who is bigger and smarter than you, you feel like you have to carry the whole load on your shoulders. That is a big burden. Here's a shocker. God isn't surprised. He's not surprised that Job couldn't handle it. He's not surprised that we can't handle it at some times. He never expected Job or us to go through this by ourselves. Isaiah. How many of us have done this? Somebody asked you, are you okay? I'm fine. I'm fine. Sometimes people can tell that you're going through something. And sometimes it's okay to just break down and say, this is what's happening. This is how I'm feeling. Look at Isaiah 41:10. Fear not, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will hold you up with my righteous right hand. So God's just telling us, You can't handle it alone, but I'm right here. You know, the scope of this verse is to silence fear and encourage strength. This verse of God's, it was encouraging a nation of Israel. It was in captivity. But it sure fits our love for our Savior Jesus Christ, who on this side of the cross certainly can offer us up faith, that we may depend on him. We have our backs against the wall. You ever felt like that? Back is against the wall. Eli, when he was with us, he wanted to watch Ice Age, the very first one. And they talk about the big mammoth. You know, how are these tigers going to take care of the big mammoth? And the one tells them, you have to get the mammoth back against the wall. So there's no way to escape. And that's how we feel sometimes. That we're backed against the wall. We have no way to go. If we just look forward, we'll see and look up. God's right there. He's right there with us. We don't know what we're fighting against. God's right there. He knows what we're fighting against. We may all see that all are sufficient, that our all-sufficient God has not given up on us. Many only want God when it's convenient and it doesn't cost anything. Job actually wanted God to respond. God, where are you? Why don't you answer me? What did I do for this to happen? We ask those questions sometimes. Yes. When Job did this, he got up and he tore his robes and shaved his head. Then he fell to the ground in worship and said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised. His wife was still asking him. But yet he still maintained his integrity. And he replied, shall I not only accept good from God and not trouble? Job found comfort by pressing into the presence of God. Where most people pull away, even though he was hurting, even though he did not have the answers, even though he thought God was doing this to him, he chose to press into God and not away from him. How many times have we felt like, I've prayed this prayer, it's not being answered. Okay, I've prayed this one. I've prayed. Where is God? Okay, God must not be listening to me. God, must not care about me. But he's there. He just wants you to continue to just work on him. Be with him. When we're humbled, God appeals healing slaves. When we're broken, we hear from God when all the noise stops. We want prosperity, perfect kids, the best house, perfect job. When we are all in a trial of our lives, we can see God for all his beauty and awesomeness. Job even sought comfort from his friends. And it's not until he sought comfort from the Lord that his situation changes. Job asked God for answers. He asked God the why questions. Why did this happen? Why have you not stepped in? Why do I feel the way I do? How many of us are afraid to ask God these why questions? We're afraid. You can't ask God why. He's God. We think we might offend God if we ask these. But God can handle our questions if you're able to handle his answers. Sometimes we may not like his answers. God didn't strike Job down for asking these questions. We need to seek advice from everyone. We always do, don't we? We always want to seek advice from everybody else before we go to God and seek His comfort. Why? Everybody else is just human like us. They're going to have those same human answers. How many of us would have been able to be as strong as Job in this situation? Think about it today. If you left here, your family was gone, your house was gone, everything, your bank account was empty. How many of us would be able to be as strong as Job? There's many that can't handle this situation. There's many that can't handle less. There's some that blame God for everything that goes wrong in their lives. But God's not the one to blame. We live in a hurt world. How many people have done this? You have two sides. This was me for the last year. My family was around. They seen the bad side. I was just existing. I was getting up. I was going to work. I was coming home. I was living in my recliner. I wasn't really living. We would come to church. We'd go home. I'd go to my recliner. But this is how I was. I had two sides. When I was around everybody, everything was fine. Put on a smiley face. Everything was good. But when I'd go home, it was a different story. And I read something by Charles Spurgeon. Cast the burden of the present, along with the sin of the past and the fear of the future, upon the Lord, who forsaken not His saints. Put not trust in frames and feelings. Trust in God alone, and lean not on the reeds of human help. Serve God with all your might while the candle is burning. And when it goes out for a season, you will have less to regret. When your own emptiness is painfully forced upon your conscience, chide yourself that you have not dreamed of being full except in Christ. Continue with double earnest to serve your Lord when no visible result is before you, when you cannot see the face of God, to trust under the shadow of His wings. Think about that. When you can't see God's face, He may have you under His wing. Who remembers the poem about the footsteps in the sand? When you look back, and it's, God, in my hardest times, there's only one set of footprints. Why did you forsake me? And God said, I didn't. That's when I was carrying you. Amen. And a lot of times we just see that and just think, God's left me. God hasn't. He's got His arms wrapped around you. You may not see His face because you're under His wing. He's protecting you. Think about how a mother bird, they keep their children under their wings and they're hidden. And I wasn't always doing this. And I always tried to figure out, how can I change my situation instead of trusting God? Robert's had to deal with the last year. We're staying. We're going to Arkansas. We're going to North Carolina. We're staying. We're, meet my mom. She goes, I'm going back to North Carolina. You guys are moving here. You're moving there. And we've decided we just need to stay. Wait. Let God. Wait and hear from God. Stop trying to figure out where God's putting us. And just be still and let God tell us. God's right there in all of our situations. And all of our situations are under His control. I've had to learn just to let go and let God work in my life. Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians, he commands his readers the importance of preaching and communicating the gospel to people. But in the midst of this, he reminds the church that the treasure we have from God is a treasure that is contained not in vessels of gold and silver, but in what the apostles call jars of clay. For this reason, he says, that The surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. Immediately after this, the apostles added, "We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed, perplexed, but not driven to despair, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed, always carrying in the body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may be manifested in our bodies." 2 Corinthians 4, 7 through 10. Paul spent a lot of his time in prison. And so this right here he was able to give these words when going through a whole lot more than most of us ever do. You know, this passage, it indicates the limits of depression that we experience. Depression may be profound, but it's not permanent, nor is it fatal. Notice that the Apostle Paul described his condition in varying ways. He said that we're afflicted, perplexed, persecuted, and struck down. These are all very powerful images that describe the conflict that Christians must endure. But in every place that he describes this phenomenon, he describes at the same time its limits. Afflicted but not crushed. Perplexed but not in despair. Persecuted but not forsaken. Struck down but not destroyed. So we have this pressure to bear. But the pressure, though it is severe, does not crush us. We may be confused or perplexed, but at that low point to which perplexity brings us, but does not result in complete and total despair, even in persecution, as serious as it may be, we are still not forsaken, and we may not be overwhelmed or struck down, as Jeremiah spoke of. Yet we have room for joy. We have to think about the prophet Habakkuk. I forget these names. You know, he was in his misery, but he remained confident that despite the setbacks he endured, God would give him feet like hinder's feet, feet that would enable him to walk in high places. I have a question. Maybe these, I know most of you grew up here. Maybe you guys did it. As a young child down in the South, when summer came, shoes came off, and we ran around without any shoes on. And that allowed us, at the beginning of the summer, our feet were hurting and stuff, but by the end of the summer, we could walk on anything. And that's how it is. You know, sometimes God has us walking on our bare feet, and at first it hurts. Man, this is hard. But then by the time we get to the end of it, oh, okay, I can handle this. I can walk on this. That's how he's describing it. Now, feet are soft to start with, and we're going through these. But then God gave him the feet to be able to walk in these high places, these hard, rocky places. You get up high, there's rocks. It's not all smooth going up. Think about the Apostle Paul in his writings to Philippians. He tells them, be anxious for nothing. He's telling them the cure for anxiety is found on one's knees. That is in the presence of God that claims our spirit, and it just disperses anxiety, disperses it. You know, we can be anxious and nervous and worried without fully submitting to the ultimate despair. We're going to go through times. We have those ups and we have those downs. You know, this coexistence of faith and spiritual depression is parallel in our biblical statements of emotional conditions. We're told that it is perfectly legitimate for believers to suffer grief. Our Lord himself was a man of sorrow and acute grief. Though grief may reach to the roots of our soul, it must not result in bitterness. Grief is a legitimate emotion, at times even a virtue. But there must be no place in the soul for bitterness. In like matter, we see that it is a good thing to go to the house of the mourning. But even in mourning, that low feeling must not give way to hatred. The presence of faith gives no guarantee of the absence of spiritual depression. However, the dark night of the soul always gives way to the brightness of the noonday, the light of the presence of God. David said this, and he said, though there may be mourning at night, the day is coming, and the day is bright. So what happens when we trust God and seek Him in all that we do? Now we're going to look back at Job, at that final chapter, and see what he did, how he came out after he questioned God, after he went through all of this. Job 42, 1 through 6 tells us, Job replied to the Lord, I know that you can do anything, and no one can stop you. You asked, who is this that questions my wisdom with such ignorance? It is I, and I was talking about things I knew nothing about. Things far too wonderful for me. You said, listen, and I will speak. I have some questions for you, and you must answer them. I had only heard about you before, but now I've seen you with my own eyes. I take back everything I said, and I sit in dust and ashes and show my repentance. So when we go through these hard times, that's when we truly see God for ourselves. Before that, we're just experiencing what others have told us, God's love. But when we go through this and we cry out to God, that's when we truly get to see Him. We see Him in the work of our lives. We see what He can do for us, what He can do through us. If you're going through these times and you think, all's lost, where's God? God's never moved. It's when you fall on your knees and you just beg and question and pray out to God. He's waiting for you to cry out to Him. He's waiting with open arms. Sometimes we get into that just steady, where we're just there. We come to church every Sunday. We do what we're supposed to. Okay, I'm good. But sometimes God's like, I want more. I want more from you. You need to seek me. So that's what we have to do. We have to seek God. And sometimes we have to ask those hard questions that we're afraid to ask. God's not afraid of them. He's got the answers. He knows what you're going through, and He's right there with you.